Welcome back. Mockito is a widely used mocking library in Java. In this video, we are going to see how we can leverage Mockito while writing unit tests. Before learning about Mockito, first let us understand what is a unit test. So here we have a class called sales service, which depends on order repository and sales reporter. And we have a method called get sales summary, in which first we are fetching a list of orders using order repository and then generating the sales summary using sales reporter. Now when we think of writing a unit test for sales service, there are usually two different approaches people follow. One is Mockito approach, another one is classicist approach. In Mockito approach, we only test the logic that resides in the subject under test, in our case sales service, by mocking all of its dependencies like order repository and sales reporter. And the other approach is you identify a unit that can be a single class or a set of classes that are all together building some feature. So in our case, if we are trying to write a unit test for sales service, I would say sales service along with order repository and sales reporter all together comes as a unit. Personally, I prefer following classicist approach because by following that approach, we don't tightly couple our tests with the implementation detail, so that at a later point of time, if we do any refactoring, there is very minimal changes that we need to make to our test suite. Otherwise, if you follow Mockito approach, kind of whenever you do any refactoring to your production code, there is a good chance that you need to update a bunch of your tests also, because you would be mocking all the dependencies, and if you break a functionality into multiple methods or multiple classes, you need to keep updating all your dependencies as well. So it's personally, I prefer writing unit test using classicist approach. Let us explore how we can write unit test by leveraging Mockito. So in our maven based project, all we need to do is add this Mockito core dependency. But if you want to use JUnit 5 Mockito extension, you can also add Mockito JUnit Jupyter. These are the two dependencies that is sufficient to get started using Mockito. So here we have a person class with fields ID, name, email and password, and we have a person service class which depends on the person repository, and then there is a method called login. So here we are first verifying whether there is a person with a given email and password, and if there is no such person, and we are returning null, otherwise we are generating a authentication token and then returning it. So this is the code we have, and assume person repository is a class which talks to database or some other external service and verify whether there is a person with the given credentials or not. So now this is the logic we have, and we want to write unit test. Because in our unit test, we don't want to talk to external services like databases or other REST APIs and things like that. We don't want to use the actual person repository. We want to use a mock, and then we want to test the behavior implemented inside our person service. So let us see how we can do that using Mockito. So here we have a person service test, and we have these two person repository and person service properties here, and inside our JUnit 5 callback method before each, we are set initializing those two. So first we are creating a mock object of person repository using mockito.mock and specifying which class we want to have a mock for, and then we are using this mock object to initialize person repository. So this is one way of creating the mock. There is another way by using JUnit 5 extension, which I will explain in a minute. And let's assume we create a repository and person service using this approach. And now we have one test which is login success. So we want to test both the scenarios: successful scenario where we get a valid token, and another failure scenarios where there is no person with the given email and password. So here, this is how we can test using Mockito. Usually we write a unit test using arrange, act and assert pattern, in which in arrange segment we set up the context for our particular test case scenario, and then in the act section we actually make the method call and perform whatever is the main behavior that we are trying to test. And then in the assert section we verify the results, whether we got the expected results or not, things like that. So here in our case, in our person service, we are calling a person repositories method like find by email and password, and we don't know whether it is going to talk to the database or it is going to talk to the external service. So let's assume it's going to talk to a database, but we don't want to talk to actual database in our case. So what we can do, we can mock that behavior, because we already created that person repository as a mock. We can set up the expectation by stubbing the find by email and password method invocation. So here, so this when is nothing but mockito.when. We are importing statically that method, and what we are saying that when we call find by email and password with these inputs on person repository, then return this option of person object. So when we call person service.login by passing these two values, so if we go and check the implementation here, it is going to call this method and then verify. But here we set up the expectation saying that when find by email and password method is called with so and so input, we are saying that then return this result. Okay, so we stop the dependencies behavior. Now what happens, because it matches with the given values, it is going to return this optional of person, and because of that it is going to get optional of person with a object inside optional, and it is going to return this token. Now finally we are asserting the token is not null, or if there is any expected value, you can even assert the token is equals to something or not, like that. Whereas in the login failure scenario, we are going to set up the mock behavior in such a way that it is not going to return any value when we call find by email and password. So how we are doing that? So here when repository.find by email and password, and if the values are this email and password, then we are saying just return optional empty, so that when it is returning optional of empty, it is going to return null instead of a token. So what we are doing, we are asserting the token is null. So like this, based on the scenario we are testing, we can set up the mock behavior on the dependencies and exercise the actual logic. Here our subject under test is person service and its dependencies is person repository. We don't want to test the behavior of person repository because it talks to external service, and we don't want to use external services like databases or any REST APIs in our unit test. So that's why we are mocking our dependency repository here and then setting the expectations. When certain method is called, what is the expected outcome, so that we can test the behavior of particular use case. Okay, let us run these tests and see whether they are working or not. So now the login success test is working fine and login failure is also working fine. Okay, so let us see few things. Here we specified when we call find by email and password on repository with specifically these inputs, siva@gmail.com and siva123 as password. So if we pass any other values, let's say .org, it is not going to match with these inputs and it is not going to return this optional of person because the inputs are not matching. We stubbed specifically on this repository.find by email only when you get a input of email as siva@gmail.com and password as siva123, then only return this optional. If you pass any different values like this, siva@gmail.org, it is not going to match with this and return this optional. So in this case, if you try to run, it is going to fail, saying that because it is not matching with these set expectations, it is going to return null or optional of empty. So it is not going to work. So in such case, suppose if you don't care about actual value of this, you just want to return a person, optional of person, irrespective of what email and password is. So what you can do, instead of specifying the exact values, you can specify any string from Mockito, and here also you can specify any string. So now what happens? It doesn't care what is the actual values that we are calling on repository.findByEmail. If it be any string, it just simply return this optional of person. Now if we run this, it will pass. So it doesn't care the actual values. When you call a method on this repository.findByEmail and password, it's going to return this optional of person. Sometimes you may have to compare only one of the argument. For example, here we are saying any string for both email and password, but let us say we don't care about the password, but we care about email. Suppose if the email is siva@gmail.com, then only return this optional. But if you specify like this, it is not going to work. It doesn't work that way. So if you are making this wild matching, like any string or anything like that, it should not pass the actual values for other arguments. What you can do, we can specify equals to the expected string. This is also coming from Mockito argument matchers. So if you have a scenario where you don't care about some of the arguments, it can be anything of certain data type, but you want to equals to some specific values for some other arguments, you can pass like this. Okay. So here, because we are passing gmail.org, but we set expectation on gmail.com, it is still not passing. Now if I pass .com, so now it is successful. Okay, so like this you can use various types, like we have any string. So similarly, there is any integer, any double, all these basic types, like any boolean and all these things. And also there is another, like if there is any class type, you can specify any of say like person dot class, something like that. So you can specify, if you don't really care about the actual values, you can specify like this. Then let us look at how we can use JUnit 5 extension instead of creating the mock and creating the person service using Mockito API like this. So what we can do, we can use JUnit 5 extends with MockitoExtension.class, and here we can use the annotation at mock, and for person service we can use at inject mocks. So with that, we don't actually need this entire before each section, because Mockito is going to take care of creating a mock for this person repository and then creating an instance of this person service by injecting the mock dependencies that we defined here into this person service. So it is going to take care of creating the person service with this mocked repository. So now we can test in the same way. Okay. So that is how we can use either JUnit 5 extension, or you can call mockito.mock of whatever the class type that you want to create mock for. So you can use whichever approach you prefer to. While using Mockito, mocking void returning methods is a little bit different. So for example, here we have in person service, we have update method which takes a person and then internally calling repository.update of person. So this method simply updates a person and it doesn't return anything. Its return type is void. So how do we mock these void returning types? So it is a little bit different than other mocking methods. So usually when a method is returning something, this is how you mock. When so and so method call, then return whatever the return type you want to return. This is how you mock a method call. But here for mocking a void returning methods, you do something like this. Do nothing dot, this do nothing is coming from Mockito, and then you call when. And here is the interesting part. Usually if you again notice, while mocking non-returning methods, you are wrapping this entire method call in when. But while mocking these void return types, you don't put report.update inside when. You just pass the object and then call update outside of this when. So most of the times this is a common confusion and people put report.update inside when and then doesn't understand why it's not working the way it is they are expecting. So here we are saying do nothing when report.update is called on any person object. So this is how we can mock. Also, there is another approach. For example, you want to throw an exception when a method is called. So this is how you can say do throw whatever the exception you want to throw when that method is called. If it is a non-void returning methods, usually how you do, you can say when report.find, then instead of return you can say then throw. So here you can say new runtime exception, whatever. So this is how you mock a method to throw some exception if it is a non-void returning method. But if it is a void returning methods, you need to do like this: do throw whatever the exception dot when the mock object and call the method. So this is a little bit different than non-void returning methods. You need to keep in mind. Also, once we have called this method, we can assert, we can verify on the mock object that we are using whether so and so method is called or not. So here by default, when we say verify update method is called with any person or not, by default it is saying it should be called only once. You can also be explicit about it by using verify repo, and you can specify times of 1. Now it is expecting only one invocation on that repo mock object on the update method. You can specify whatever the number of times you are calling on this one. Similarly, there are other helper methods also, like at most once or at least once. So if you are calling that method in a loop and you are expecting it to be called one or more times, something like that, these methods comes in very handy. Next, let us understand an interesting concept provided by Mockito called ArgumentCaptor. First, let us understand what is the use case for it and then see how we can use that. So here in our person service, we have a create method which takes name, email and password, and then create a person object. And here notice that in email, whatever the value we are giving, we are converting it to lowercase. And then first we are checking whether there is a person already exists with a given email. If present, we are throwing exception person already exists with so and so email. Otherwise, we are creating a new person by calling repository.create and giving the person, which returns a person object, which again we are returning to the caller. So here, in order to test this behavior, we need to stub two methods on repository.find by email and repository.create, so that we need to return a person object from this repository.create. So here, in order to test this, we can write the test like this. So first we need to stub find by email with whatever the email that you want to check, and then return optional of empty. To simulate there is no person already exists with siva@gmail.com. And then we need to stub the behavior of repository.create to return a person also. But here is the interesting part, like in earlier cases, we have a different object or whatever the return value that we want to return, and then we are saying then return so and so. But here we don't want to return a different object. Instead, whatever the object that is passed to this create method, I want to return the same object. I don't want to create a new object and then specify it. Whatever the object that I am passing to this repository.create, I want to return the same object. So how do we set that stub behavior? So here when repository.create, again, as I said, it doesn't care what is the actual person object that you are passing. So we are specifying any person object. Then instead of returning some person object directly, we can use then answer. And here we are using a lambda which contains, we can get details about the called arguments and whatever the return methods, things like that. So here we are saying get argument of 0. So what does it do? When we call this person service.create, it will go and execute all this, and then finally it is going to call repository.create method with this argument, which is argument 0. So what we are stubbing here is when a method, when create method is called on this repository, whatever the first argument, return that when we call create. So that is what we are stubbing here. And then we are actually invoking the create method on the person service, passing these values. And notice here I have Siva in capital letters, and then password is 123 Siva 123. And finally I am asserting the created person object name is Siva as it is, and person's email is siva@gmail.com, all in lowercase, because I am expecting when before saving email should be converted to lowercase. So I am asserting this. So this is the interesting part where it comes very handy, like when you are using Spring Data JPA or anything like that, and you have methods like dot save, which also return the saved object. So this is how you can stop that behavior, so that whatever the value you are passing to, you can also return same thing as a response. So this is how you can do it. And the next interesting thing is here, when we call this create method by passing these different individual values for name, email and all, internally we are expecting a person object is passed to this repository.create method. And let's say we want to also ensure that this person object contains the values like whatever the name we pass, and email should be in lowercase and password is so and so. So we want to ensure that repository.create method is called with some person object with the expected values. So here is the interesting part where we can achieve that using ArgumentCaptor. So we are going to expect the argument of type person. So we are creating ArgumentCaptor of person like this, and then we are verifying. This is again coming from Mockito.verify. We are verifying repo.create is called, and instead of specifying the any person object, we are saying argument.capture, and then we can get the actual value that is called during the execution as ArgumentCapture.getValue. So when we call this create method, internally it is going to call repo.create. So this value is nothing but that person object, and we can assert, okay, this is the person object that is called with repo.create, and we can assert the values. So this is an interesting feature of Mockito, where you don't have direct values that you are passing as inputs. Instead, they are being constructed within the code that you are testing, where you don't have a direct reference to. In such cases, this ArgumentCaptor really helps to assert the behavior. Next, let us understand what is a spy and in what kind of scenarios we should use spy instead of mock. So in Mockito, when you create a mock, it doesn't use the actual person repository class here. Instead, it will create a mock, and whenever you call any method on repository, it will, by default, it's going to return a null value. For example, if your method is returning a string, it's going to return null. If your method is returning an integer, it's going to return default value 0. Like that. It doesn't actually call the actual method that is there inside person repository. But as I said earlier, while writing unit tests, we should aim to use the actual code as much as possible and then limit the number of usages of mocks to bare minimum. So let us take an example of here sales service we have. And as we talked about earlier, there is a get sales summary method which gets the list of orders from order repository. And if we take a look at this get orders, here maybe we are talking to a database or get the data from other APIs, and we are returning list of orders. So here we don't want to use the actual order repository because it is talking to the database. Instead, we want to use a mock for order repository. And then once we got the list of orders, we are using sales reporter class with generate sales summary. And here it is not using any other external service. It is all exercising the logic that is based on the values that we are passing to that method. So here I don't want to mock sales reporter behavior. I actually want to use the actual logic that is written in sales reporter class. Okay, so now if I want to write a test for sales service, I want to mock only order repository, but I want to use actual sales reporter class. So how we can do that? So this is where spy comes in handy. So if you go to sales service test here, what we can do, if we are not using JUnit 5 extension, we can use order repository as a Mockito mock. And then you can create actual class new sales reporter, and then you can create new sales service equals to new sales service like this. Or if you are using Mockito extension, you can use @mock for order repository and @spy for sales reporter. So how it spy different from mock? So here it is going to use the actual implementation of sales reporter. So when you call a method on sales reporter, it is going to actually call the actual implementation that is there inside sales reporter instead of mocking the entire behavior. So this is how I want to use, and once I create a mock and spy, I can inject those into my sales service class, and then I can test the behavior. So here I have a test get sales summary, and I want to mock only order repository get orders. Here I am passing a product code, and then I am returning a list of orders. And I am not mocking any behavior on sales reporter because I actually want to use a sales reporter implementation. And then I am making a call get sales summary, and then I got the response, and then I am asserting to it. So this is where spy comes into handy, where you actually want to use the implementation of it instead of mocking the whole behavior. Now let me run this test. So the test is passing. And a benefit of using spy is we can actually verify whether certain methods are called on sales reporter or not. So here we can verify sales reporter dot generate sales summary, and I don't care about the actual value here. So I can verify this method is called on this spy or not. Okay, so this comes handy, like you can use the actual implementation, and also if you want to verify whether certain method is called with so and so input or not, you can do that as well. Finally, let us talk about some best practices and anti-patterns of using Mockito. So the first thing to keep in mind is don't mock what you don't own. What does that mean? Let's say you are using some framework like Spring Data, JPA, or whatever the framework that you are using. So do not mock the internal implementations of those libraries. If you want to use that library for verifying some behavior, instead of using Mockito and then mocking the internals of that library or framework, write an integration test. Because if you are mocking the libraries that you don't own, it will become a painful experience while upgrading to a new library, and the implementations changed over the time, so you don't have full control over that code. So do not mock those third-party libraries in your code. Okay. And the next thing is use mocking sparingly. As I said in the beginning of the video, though mocking comes really handy at times, especially when you want to simulate some error conditions or something like that, Mockito really helps. But use mocking sparingly and try to test your code using the real implementation as much as possible. So that is ultimately what we are going to run in production, right? Instead of using mocks, if at all possible, try to use the actual implementation and test your logic. Don't couple test logic with the implementation details. By default, the unit tests are kind of a white box testing. You know the implementation details, but that doesn't mean that your test should be coupled with the implementation details. That is one of the reasons I prefer to go for a classist approach, where you try to find a bigger scope of unit and then test, leaving all the implementation details without getting into your tests. So that is one of the reasons. While writing verifications, keep in mind that just because you can do it doesn't mean you should do it. Because here, now if you keep verifying like this, if in future, if somebody wants to refactor the update method, all the tests that are using these kind of verifications are going to fail, and you need to refactor that as well. So understand when it is okay to do the verifications about the implementation detail, because this is an implementation detail. We are calling this person service.update method and we are verifying an implementation detail here. But because in this case it is a void method, and the only way to ensure that it is properly called is to verify this method call on the internal dependency. But in other scenarios, do not go for verifying all these methods with at least once, at most once and all, because it's going to tightly couple your test with the implementation detail. So use these verifications sparingly, and so that it will allow over the time you can enhance the logic inside update, and still you can assert the expected behavior. So do not couple your test with implementation details. Finally, most of the times the real challenge is defining the scope of unit properly. As I said, there is no hard and fast rule that says this is how a unit is. Like it doesn't necessarily mean a single class is unit, or how do you define it. All depends on the logic you have, and you need to identify for your particular use case what makes a unit. Is it a single class, or is it a group of tightly coupled classes? That you need to define as a scope of unit. Then you will be able to write tests that are not tightly coupled with the implementation details. So that's all for this video. I hope this video is helpful for understanding how to use Mockito, and stay tuned for the upcoming videos. Thank you. Bye bye.